We're going to study exchanges in a little more detail and depth. In fact, within economic theory, we're now going to get into a subdiscipline or subset, which is the general theory of exchange, also known as katalaxy, from the Greek word katalatein, which means to exchange. We're going to concentrate on exchanges because they define the quintessential social relationship. According to Mises, there are two types of exchanges. We'll call one intrapersonal exchanges, and we'll call the other interpersonal exchanges. Intrapersonal exchanges are also called autistic exchanges. We all know how autistic children behave, don't we? They withdraw into themselves and seem detached from the outside world. Well, all those actions in which we do not rely on other human beings at all are called intrapersonal, within one human being. The actions Robinson Crusoe performs alone on his island are autistic exchanges. When Robinson Crusoe decides to stop hunting in order to build himself a hut, he is making a sort of exchange between two alternatives open to him. But the exchange does not involve other human beings. He stops hunting in favor of his decision to build a hut. Another typical example, both Mises and Kiertzner often give it, is that of a lone, isolated hunter who must constantly make decisions. He needs to either chase an animal or not chase it, etc. These actions are intrapersonal or autistic exchanges. Well, you can consider them as important as you wish, but from a social standpoint, the truly crucial actions, the most important by far, are not these, but ones we'll call interpersonal exchanges. Interpersonal exchanges consist of giving something to others in order to receive from them in return what one needs. Thus, they are actions that involve two or more human beings. And they are reflected in the old Latin adage from Roman law, do ut des. Do, I give, ut, so that, des, you give to me. This Latin expression perfectly captures the essence of an interpersonal exchange, a do ut des. I give to you so that you will give to me. In fact, the interpersonal exchange relationship between two human beings is the quintessential social relationship. Today we're going to study exchanges in depth, but I would like you to visualize and understand that all human interactions can ultimately be reduced to exchanges. Even when a person seems to expect nothing in return, there is an exchange. When Mother Teresa of Calcutta wanted to help a needy person without expecting anything in return, an exchange did take place within her, because what gave her satisfaction was helping those in need. It's true that the exchange was intrapersonal. As is logical, all commercial transactions which involve monetary units are exchanges, as are barter transactions, exchanges without money. We'll talk about those right away. Nevertheless, all human interactions in the sphere of friendship are exchanges as well. When we have a friend we're comfortable with, and we like to go out with that person, and we tell each other our problems, there is an exchange relationship between us, even if the other person merely listens to us and gives us his or her time. Many times, all we need is someone to listen to our problems and give us a shoulder to cry on. After we've rattled on for a while, even if we haven't let the other person get a word in edgewise, we feel better, and we go home relieved. We may even give our friend a pat on the back and a thank you. What a great conversationalist you are. What do you mean, conversationalist? You haven't let me say a single word. The exchange relationship between the sexes is also very clear. Each gives to the other. In fact, the exchange in any relationship you can think of will be more obvious or less, and the necessary analysis may be more abstract or less, but something is always given, and something is always received. Interpersonal exchanges can occur in two different ways. They can occur by mutual agreement between the parties, that is, voluntarily, or they can involve coercion.
También,
An act of coercion also constitutes an exchange, even if it is a forced exchange. If I'm walking down the street and suddenly some muggers appear and say to me, "Your money or your life," think about it. They've got a gun to my head. I have two alternatives. I either hand over my wallet or they shoot and kill me. So I have to choose. If the threat is believable, I hand over my wallet in exchange for my life. In the case of a mugging, the approach is quite clear. Your money or your life. There is an exchange. The same is true in the case of rape, etc. This second type of exchange differs radically from the first type we mentioned. An exchange which takes place voluntarily, in other words, by mutual agreement between the parties. We will refer to a society, or process of human interaction, in which voluntary exchanges predominate as a society based on contractual ties, and we will refer to a society in which coercive exchanges predominate as a society based on hegemonic ties. The essential difference between one type of exchange, the voluntary type, and the other, the coercive type, lies in whether or not physical violence is used or threatened. This is a very important point. If there is no physical violence, nor a threat of physical violence, and it must be discernible, observable from the outside. If we cannot perceive any physical violence nor threat of it, then the exchange is voluntary. If we do observe physical violence or a threat of physical violence, like someone putting a gun to our heads, then the exchange is coercive. What I'm saying, in a nutshell, is that the difference between one type of exchange, the voluntary type, and the other, the coercive type, must be clear and obvious from the outside. There must be physical contact. Look, forgive me for bothering you, I'm using you to illustrate my point. Physical contact or a gun, a threat. Why am I dwelling on this? Why am I emphasizing the importance of contact, of actual physical violence? That, or the threat of physical violence, is key. I am emphasizing the point because any exchange that occurs without physical violence or the threat of it is a voluntary exchange by definition, an exchange by mutual agreement. So, we're not talking about internal violence. For instance, I have a very large family, 6 children to feed. Whenever I come home, "Daddy, Daddy," I can see them suffering, and I'm out of a job. I'm in such a desperate situation that I'm compelled to take a terrible job that pays only €1 an hour. Someone in that situation might say, "I'm forced to." But is this coercion? No. In economic theory, we deal with human relationships. And there is a clear difference between the use or threat of violence, quite obviously a coercive exchange, which gives rise to a society based on hegemonic ties, and voluntary exchanges, regardless of the specific array of inner circumstances that might lead me to make a decision about an exchange. I'm going to get married. It's perfectly obvious. If I marry at gunpoint or under threat of violence, the exchange is coercive. But if I'm simple-minded, and my mother pressures me all day long to get married, and my friends do too, and I see myself as the black sheep of the family, and finally I'm compelled to marry, it is only in a figurative sense that I am compelled. From our point of view as social scientists, since there is no physical coercion, nor a threat of physical violence, the exchange, or the action, is voluntary. I mention it because there is a huge amount of manipulation in this regard, in both language and the interpretation of events. Many people, precisely to justify violence and coercion, resort to misrepresenting exchanges as forced, when really they are not. The difference must be objectively discernible to an outside observer, physical violence or the threat of physical violence. Logically, if some people kidnap one of my children and tell me they're going to kill my child if I don't do this or that, it is identical or comparable to their holding a gun to my head. I make the point because this difference will distinguish between a society based on contractual ties and a society based on hegemonic ties. Also, the enemies of a free society invariably turn to the old, stale, false and fallacious claim that the freedom or the voluntary nature of exchanges in open societies is merely a matter of form, because ultimately workers are forced to take terrible jobs, etc. Forced by whom? Who puts a gun to their heads? And this claim is used to justify a society that truly is based on hegemonic ties. Its supporters call it the dictatorship of the proletariat. And there, guns held to people's heads and shots in the back of the neck really do prevail. Notice the paradox. Point number one. A society based on contractual ties. When society is organized in this way, social cooperation rests on contracts. This is precisely why Mises refers to a society based on contractual bonds. Cooperation takes place by virtue of contract. The contract is a legal institution which embodies precisely a voluntary exchange. I give you something in exchange for your giving me something. In contrast, point number one on the right side of the table, a society based on hegemonic ties is organized by virtue of command and subordination. Command and subordination. Note the difference. A contract embodies a voluntary exchange, regardless of the subjective motivations the parties may have or how desperate they may feel. In voluntary exchanges, what matters is that there be no physical violence nor a threat of physical violence. On the other hand, in societies based on hegemonic ties, contracts do not predominate. Instead, command and subordination predominate. In other words, you, do this. Yes, sir. And if you don't do it, you're placed under arrest or shot. Command. I command you and you obey. That is not a contract. That is precisely the way coercion manifests itself in the social process. Point number two. Therefore, in societies based on contractual ties, relationships between human beings are symmetrical. What does it mean to say they are symmetrical? It means that exchanges take place between two parties without either party being able to coerce the other. Be careful. I'm going to give you an example to better illustrate my point, to make it clear, so you're not taken aback. If a capitalist tycoon hires a very needy worker for extremely low wages, a symmetrical exchange has occurred. I'm going to approach it from that angle. Both a contractual tie and symmetry exist. Symmetry is lacking if workers become picketers and organize a violent strike. Then they use or threaten physical violence to obtain higher wages than their employers were willing to pay them voluntarily. The picketers also beat up strikebreakers, people who would be willing to work for those wages, or they occupy the factory, or they occupy or set fire to the streets. There the physical violence is quite clear. So there is symmetry in a contract. Both parties are on the same level in the exchange, while, point number two on the right, in a society based on hegemonic ties, relationships are asymmetrical. What does that mean? It means the parties are on different levels. Some people command and others obey. Some people give orders and others are obliged to follow them. Slavery is the crystal clear example. The master orders the slave to do something, and the slave says, "Yes, master," because, among other reasons, if he doesn't say, "Yes, master," and do what the master says, he gets 100 lashes. A perfectly clear example of slavery is the army, compulsory military service. If soldiers are there voluntarily, nothing can be said, as long as they enlist for a specific period of time and they can get out. But if military service is compulsory, it is complete slavery. In fact, we had slavery in Spain even in the 20th century, until relatively recently, when voluntary military service was established. Point number three. In a society based on contractual ties, each human being pursues his or her own ends. I make voluntary exchanges with other people because I believe I achieve my ends better that way. But the ends each person strives to accomplish are his or her own, whatever they may be. As you know, ends are determined by each acting subject. However, point number 3 on the right, in a society based on hegemonic ties, people do not pursue their own ends, but the ends of the one who commands. In other words, the person who uses coercion, gives orders and commands others, imposes his or her own ends on other people, and the subordinates who must obey those commands are at the service not of their own ends, but of the ends of the one in charge. This is very important. Point number 4. We say that in a society based on contractual ties, wealth is acquired by economic means. I repeat, in a society based on contractual ties, wealth is acquired by economic means. What do we understand by the term economic means? The means which are the focus of catalaxy, the general science of exchange. In fact, all economic theory, to which we are devoting this course, focuses on studying this process of voluntary exchange. Meanwhile, in a society based on hegemonic ties, wealth is acquired by political means. Write that down. Note the contrast. Economic means and political means. A society based on coercion is a politicized society in which there are more and more civil servants, more and more bureaucrats. An increasing amount of time, ingenuity and effort is spent not on trying to detect the needs of our fellow human beings and satisfy them through a voluntary process, but on influencing the political decision-making process. Obtaining aid and subsidies, and staging demonstrations. 100,000 farmers paralyzed Madrid. Why? Were any of these farmers shouting, "We want to satisfy the desires of consumers"? "We're taking to the streets because we want to find products that are more and more affordable and of higher and higher quality"? Our goal in life is to meet the needs of others? No, of course not. They took to the street to say, "We want more subsidies. We want more bonuses. We want more." And where is the money supposed to come from? From the national budget. And tomorrow, air traffic controllers will be making the same demands. The day after tomorrow, miners. The next day, the banking sector. In a society based on hegemonic ties, all people try to solve their problems by political means, and they forget about economic means, which consist simply of a day-to-day effort well made, by the sweat of the brow, to serve others. Such is the spontaneous market order. Such is the capitalist system. It is the system of peaceful exchange. In contrast lies the politicized society based on hegemonic ties, in which everyone runs to Papa State to try to gain special privileges and advantages over others. The political versus the economic. If you travel, you will notice that the most politicized societies are the most coercive, and vice versa. The least politicized are the least coercive. In Switzerland, for instance, the political news takes much less time to report on TV than it does in Spain. And sometimes people on the street, even educated people, are asked who the president of the Swiss Confederation is, who the members of the Federal Council are, and they don't know. They don't care. It's not vital to them. The state wields much less influence there than it does in Spain. However, in Spain, it is really vital to know who is in power, because almost everyone, one way or another, is affected by subsidies. Students are the first to benefit from them. Students pay an absurdly low percentage of the actual cost of studying at a university. There we see hegemonic ties. Other people are coerced, forced to pay taxes to support you in your idleness. And if they don't pay taxes, they go to jail. And if they try to escape, they can be shot. Hegemonic ties, command and control, versus contractual ties. The search for wealth by economic means versus the search for wealth by political means. What do political means amount to? The use of violence. That's it. Politics is a euphemism for force, for violence, for the use of coercion. In this case, institutional coercion applied by the state. We'll be talking more about that in the future. Point number 5. In a society based on contractual ties, what is known as the rule of law prevails. Note down, if you wish, the rule of substantive law. All human beings are equal before the law. The only acceptable equality in a society based on contractual ties is equality before the law. Equality before the law means we are all on the same level. We are equal only in one sense. We are equal from the standpoint of the law in abstract and formal terms, substantive law. Traditionally, this was called the rule of law. But over the years, I have come to the conclusion that the phrase, a state governed by the rule of law, what can I say? It's a contradiction in terms. To talk about a state governed by the rule of law is like talking about a square circle. It's like talking about hot snow, or if you will, a wanton virgin. These three expressions aren't mine. We owe them to Antony de Jesse, a great Hungarian-born economist and philosopher who currently lives in France. In short, though such a state may be an ideal, it is an unattainable ideal. I have evolved over the years, and in the year 2000, I ceased to be a classical liberal. I ceased to believe a state governed by the rule of law was possible, and I became an anarchist. I am convinced that it is impossible. Once the state exists, it is impossible for it to be governed by the rule of law. It would be really nice if we could conceive of a square circle, but that is a contradiction in terms. In any case, this is an opinion of your professor. Make a footnote of it if you'd like. Mises, who is much more moderate, much less radical than I am, believes a state governed by the rule of law is possible and should be defended. What can I say? If it were possible, then it would certainly be a worthy goal to achieve. Traditionally, it is thought that a society based on contractual ties takes the form of a state in which the rule of law prevails. A state in which we are all equal before the law. However, if we take human nature into account, the moment an agency with a monopoly on violence is introduced, it's like mixing nitroglycerin. It's a highly volatile and dangerous, unstable explosive. Because politicians almost inevitably want to buy our votes, and a vicious cycle emerges in which we allow ourselves to be bought, and we begin to ask for subsidies. In other words, there is no state governed by the rule of law anywhere. But anyway, if the state must exist, traditionally it was said that a society based on contractual ties takes the form of a state in which the rule of law prevails, in which we are all equal before the law. Meanwhile, in a society based on hegemonic ties, the state is dictatorial. And imagine the dictator is, oh, I don't know, the best person you can imagine. The former Pope, for instance. The dictator is Pope Benedict XVI. Well, the state will be paternalistic. It's irrelevant who's in power. Everybody thinks all social problems would be solved if only we could remove the person in power and replace him or her with someone else. With whom? With our own candidate. Well, that idea is radically mistaken. People used to say, oh, what a disaster. Let's remove Zapatero and replace him with Rajoy. It makes no difference who's in power, if a society is based on hegemonic ties, on command and control. A dictatorial or paternalistic state is a state governed by regulations, a state governed by administrative law, which embodies precisely the commands of the person in power. In contrast, lies a state in which the rule of law prevails. Notwithstanding my observations on whether or not it is possible, I'm convinced it's an impossible utopia. Anyway, in a state where the rule of law prevails, we would all be equal before the law in the substantive sense. Later, we will see that there are huge differences between substantive law, which prevails in states with the rule of law, or should prevail, and formal law, which embodies mere administrative commands. Substantive law is abstract law which applies equally to everyone. For instance, the prohibition of murder, of theft, and of breach of contract. These are substantive laws. Meanwhile, the commands or regulations that govern a society based on hegemonic ties prescribe concrete actions in specific circumstances. You earn 50,000 euros, you owe this much in taxes. You earn 100,000, this much. You earn 4,000, this much. Prescriptions for pharmaceutical products must be like this or like that, and a regulation issued by the EU or authorities in Madrid states how bridges must be built. These are orders for concrete actions. They are commands, and whether they are called laws or not, they are not substantive laws. Point number 6. In a society based on contractual ties, the definition of freedom is very simple. Freedom is the absence of coercion. That is, the absence of physical violence or the threat of it. The moment there is no coercion, we can all lead our lives as we see fit, given our life circumstances, of course. If I'm not subjected to violence, I can lead my life as I please. But what I cannot say is, hey, I want a Rolls Royce, and I want a yacht, and I want to travel to the moon, and I want to be married to a Miss World, etc. So I'm frustrated and coerced by my circumstances, because my wife is fat and ugly. I don't have a car. I can't go to the moon, and I'm earning miserable wages. I'm coerced. No, you are coerced only in your warped and confused mind. Nobody is coercing you from the outside. And I repeat, that is the essential point. In a society based on contractual ties, freedom consists precisely of the absence of coercion. This allows each of us, within our own life circumstances, to live as we wish. Meanwhile, note the devious, subtle, treacherous and demeaning way the concept of freedom is redefined in a society based on hegemonic ties. In such a society, freedom is no longer understood as the absence of coercion. Instead, it is either explicitly or implicitly redefined and understood as follows. Freedom is the power to do something. I'm free if I can do something. Furthermore, this applies especially to the power of the dictator or the person in charge. And it makes no difference to me whether we're talking about an individual dictator or a dictatorship of the majority in a so-called democratic system. In a society based on hegemonic ties, we want freedom means we want the power to do whatever we feel like doing. And if it's necessary to use violence, that's okay. Because if not, we're not free. I'm not free because I don't have a grand enough house. So I'm justified in taking resources from you to get that house using violence. Notice, the power to do something. You will see how this belief pervades, is incorporated into, seeps into society without our realizing it. It corrupts us. We stop appreciating freedom as the absence of coercion, and we begin to worship it like an idol, as the power to do whatever we want in any situation. Then the essential indicator of whether there is freedom or not is no longer the existence of physical violence or the threat of physical violence. Instead, a person is free if he or she has the power to do many things. I'm not free if I can't have the car I want. Hey, what a nice car. Why don't I have a car like Professor Huerta de Soto's? Well, I'll just break a window, hotwire the car and take it. Hell, that's what a free man would do. He'd do whatever he wanted. And that hot girl? Well, it turns out she pays no attention to me. Well, I'll just threaten her with a gun and rape her. Who does she think she is? Since when can't I do whatever I want? I want to be free. No, don't laugh. I'm free. Free. Everybody sing. Well, of course. And what's more, we're constantly tempted to be conceited and to expect to be able to do whatever we want. Notice the perverse way the concept of freedom is redefined and demeaned in a society based on hegemonic ties. There, we come to understand freedom as the power to do whatever we want at any moment, and especially whatever the person in command wants, of course. That's why my candidate's being in power is so vital to my being able to do whatever I want. And that's why elections are so vital. And we all take to the streets to fight for our candidate, as if we were at a soccer game. I want my team to win, because then it will be easier for me to do whatever I want. And we forget the true traditional concept of freedom, around which a society based on contractual ties revolves, and that is the concept of the absence of coercion. In short, though perhaps in a very crude fashion, we have opposed two extreme cases for educational purposes, so that we can better grasp the topic at hand. The society based on contractual ties is ultimately the one that has fostered Western civilization. Of course, there have been enormous disparities between different historical periods. There have also been many obstacles, and corruption from the world of hegemonic ties has constantly threatened Western civilization in numerous circumstances and to a very high degree, and it does so even today. However, any true liberty that remains in the West depends on contracts, on freedom, understood as the absence of coercion, on the attempt to ensure states are governed by the rule of law, though it is impossible. And what are we contrasting with this? Well, societies of the ancient world, ancient empires from the cradle of history, Mesopotamia, Egypt. Do you think the pyramids would have been built in a society based on contractual ties? Not even Athens, the apparent birthplace of liberty in the Western world, was without scoundrels. For example, Pericles. With great effort, all of the cities together created a joint fund for defense against the Persians. Well, in the end, the Persians did not attack, and the fund was unnecessary. And do you think that Politico, like all those of today, returned the money to the cities that had contributed to the fund? He kept it. For what? To build the Parthenon. Imagine that. But he put up a cast gold statue to honor those who had contributed. Any magnificent ancient monument, you see, whether it be the Parthenon, or what's left of it, or the ruins of an Egyptian pyramid, is always a manifestation of violence, of the hegemony of the one in charge. And you can be sure it was built with the blood, sweat and tears of slaves. So, such monuments should not be a source of pride for humanity, but the opposite. We should visit them as we visit the concentration camps of Auschwitz, with a heavy heart and with thoughts of the terrible suffering and the many deaths and sacrifices that went into those buildings. But history is written by the victors. If you look into textbooks, you see that the poor students who receive a state-monopolized education are brainwashed, and so everyone is very happy to see the Egyptian pyramids. On top of that, people think, the Egyptians were sure clever, the pharaohs were remarkable, Napoleon was a great man. The Nazi dictatorship, Marxist dictatorships, social democratic dictatorships, they all embody hegemonic ties. And what about the society we live in? What about the society in which we function? Well, it's neither a society based purely on contractual ties, nor is it a Nazi dictatorship. The actual cases we can observe fall somewhere in the middle, though they differ in degree. They are closer to one extreme than the other, and our particular tendencies depend on historical circumstances. Nevertheless, the analysis we have considered today is very illustrative, and can help us to better interpret what goes on around us, especially the way the world around us is evolving at this point in the 21st century. We're ready to start talking about economic calculation. Economic calculation is, if you will, the center around which Mises constructs his theory of social cooperation. The term calculation derives from the Latin calx, calcis, and the limestone pebbles that were used in abacuses were called calculi. Calculation. To calculate. How is it possible, and this is the key question the analysis of economic calculation must answer, how is it possible that if all action and exchanges in society spring from subjective valuations and comparisons that cannot be measured, as we have seen, that in the market, constantly, every day, at every moment, at this very instant, human beings, economic agents, are nevertheless making numerical calculations to carry out and direct their actions? As we've already said, value is the more or less psychically intense appreciation the actor assigns to the end, and that appreciation is a psychic intensity that cannot be measured. I may like Laura more than Beatrice. I may like her a lot more, a little more, about the same or less, but what I cannot do is take a measurement. The internal realm of psychic intensities, that is, of likes and dislikes, cannot be objectively measured from the outside with a measuring rod. It is a realm that permits only comparisons. In other words, putting things in order. That's why it's called an ordinal realm. I like alternative A much more than B, or I like it quite a bit more, or I like it more. Yes, but tell me how much? 1.12 or 1.13? Well, I don't know. I like it a lot more, or a little more, or today I like it about the same, or I'm undecided, or I like it less, or a lot less, or I simply hate it. The internal realm of subjective valuations, which ultimately fuels all human actions, is a psychic realm. It consists of unmeasurable psychic intensities, and it permits us only to make comparisons, to order our valuations on a value scale. Thus, we call it an ordinal realm. The entire economy rests on this realm of subjective valuations, which does not permit measurements. Nevertheless, in the world around us, we are constantly seeing numbers and economic calculations. If we apply for a job, we ask, how much does the job pay? Well, it pays 1,625 euros. And at this moment, perhaps the Frankfurt Stock Exchange is closing, or 2 hours from now, the New York Stock Exchange will close, and we all go look at the market prices, in dollars, the closing prices of different stocks, the indexes. Or we study balance sheets filled with numbers, or we go to a store, the Corte Inglés for instance, and we see that each product has a price on it. Numbers, 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 and numbers are cardinal. They allow us to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. How is it possible to move from the subjective, internal realm of unmeasurable valuations to the external realm of computation and numerical calculations? Well, basically, thanks to two institutions. As you recall, the term institution refers to any customary pattern or rule of behavior. Moreover, we noted that institutions emerge in an evolutionary manner. There is no guarantee that institutions will emerge. Institutions may develop and then disappear, or human beings themselves may destroy them through suicidal conduct. We're talking about language. We're talking about the family. There are two historically contingent institutions which have emerged until now, but there is no guarantee that they will continue to exist. In fact, in the last century, much of mankind was set on destroying these two institutions. The vital institutions which make possible the connection between our subjective, ordinal, internal realm and the external realm of computation are, on the one hand, money, and on the other hand, voluntary exchanges. Now I must at least introduce money. We defined money as any commonly and generally accepted medium of exchange. That is the definition of money, and money is a social institution. In fact, we will see that it is the quintessential social institution. We will see that money emerges in an evolutionary manner. The other institution which makes possible the bridge that connects the internal realm with the external realm consists of voluntary exchanges and private property. If there is a voluntary exchange and money exists, then we will see that frequently historical ratios of exchange take shape and are expressed in monetary units. We will call these ratios market prices. A market price is any historical ratio of exchange expressed in monetary units, and when a price emerges, it takes a numerical form, which enables us to estimate, through computation, what we think will happen in the future or what we believe happened in the past. So the two institutions that make possible economic calculation, understood as the bridge which connects the internal realm of subjective valuations with the external realm of computation, are, on the one hand, money, and on the other hand, voluntary exchanges. If there is no money, or if voluntary exchanges are prevented, or if both conditions exist at the same time, the bridge which connects the realm of our subjective valuations with the external realm is destroyed, and with it, economic calculation. That is precisely a short summary of the theorem of the impossibility of socialism, which we will be discussing. Why does socialism fail? In scientific terms, socialism is an impossibility because it precludes economic calculation. Traditional socialism, real socialism, was understood as that system of social organization in which all capital goods and factors of production are public property. By definition, the exchange of machinery, facilities and factories is prohibited. There is no stock market. Therefore, there are no exchanges. Monetary prices for those goods do not take shape. And as a result, it is impossible for human beings to calculate the value of the different alternatives that present themselves. They act completely in the dark. A social system of these characteristics is an impossible system. It is a system condemned to collapse.
Well,
we have talked about two types of exchanges, intrapersonal and interpersonal exchanges, and we have broken down the latter into voluntary and coercive exchanges. Now we are going to concentrate on voluntary interpersonal exchanges and consider the problem of economic calculation, which we have introduced with our bridge diagram. However, to gain a deeper understanding of what makes economic calculation possible, we must make a third division of our topic. Voluntary exchanges can be of two types. So-called direct exchanges are those in which goods and services are directly traded for others without any involvement of money. Direct exchanges are also called bartering. And all of us, some more than others, have entered into barter transactions. I remember when I was little, I used to go to school on the bus with other kids, and we would get bored, so we collected trading cards. We were always eager for new cards to come out, and we would run to buy them. Well, the people who ran the trading card companies were very smart, and they would issue a large number of cards with certain players on them, and very few with others. Cards with certain players were quite scarce, so in our free time, each of us would walk around with a stack like this of the cards we had duplicates of, and we would show them to another child. He or she would say, "I have it, I have it, I have it, I have it, I don't have it." And that meant there was the possibility of making a trade. Now, show me yours. I have it, I have it. We'd do this until we found one we lacked, and then we'd exchange one card for another. An exchange of trading cards is a direct exchange, or a barter transaction. There are many other sorts of direct exchanges. For example, if we share an apartment, one of us might say, "Hey, could you wash dishes for me today if I do your shopping tomorrow?" So we negotiate, and perhaps we close the deal. Bartering. Money has not been used. I'm sure you can think of many other barter transactions. In contrast with direct exchange or bartering, we have indirect exchange. What is an indirect exchange? It is one in which goods and services are traded using money. That is, the commonly and generally accepted medium of exchange we have just talked about. This is a different situation. Here, I hand over a good or a service in exchange for money, and with that money, I buy what I want. That's why it's called an indirect exchange. I don't directly obtain what I want in the exchange. Instead, I always ask for money, and then with the money, I acquire what I want. As you see, the exchange is indirect. For example, let's say I sell 1 kilo of butter for 20 euros, or I buy 1 kilo for 20 euros. I hand over the money, and the moment money appears, the exchange becomes indirect. Later, we will see that with bartering, an essential problem arises. It's the problem I've just described, and illustrated with the example of trading cards. To close the deal, the other party must have the card I need or lack, and at the same time, I must have a duplicate of the card he or she needs or lacks. This is called the double coincidence of wants. For a barter transaction to be completed, there must be a double coincidence of wants. If there isn't, then the transaction is not completed. So, the problem of the double coincidence of wants is an insurmountable obstacle to bartering. Societies based on bartering alone are very underdeveloped societies, because the context for exchanges is extremely limited. Imagine an economics professor who had to use bartering. I would give you economics lessons. You're here, so in theory, you're interested in the lessons. But what do I need? Well, I need to buy a pair of shoes. Are there any shoemakers in class? No. I also need to buy a suit. Are there any tailors here? No. I also need to eat. Does anyone own a restaurant or a grocery store that could provide food? No? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be off. I'm going to go look for someone who needs economic lessons and also happens to have what I need. In fact, if you tell me the services you provide, I'm sure I don't need any of them. And yet, how is it that we're here? We're here precisely because the problem of the double coincidence of wants that arises with bartering can be solved with money. So it becomes irrelevant to me what you can provide, because if you give me money, I can use money to acquire whatever I want in the market. Money makes possible an exponential increase in the number of exchanges. Exchanges without money are reduced to a tiny fraction, and therefore backward societies, in which almost everything is for personal consumption, reduce the scope of social interactions, or of exchanges, to a minimum. When money emerged, the chances of making exchanges, the chances of human interactions, increased almost to infinity, and modern civilization emerged. I say that money is the quintessential social institution because it is precisely in that social process of exponential increase in exchanges, in human interactions, that, since I have to communicate with other people in the market, what used to be the dialects of specific regions or valleys converge, and languages like Spanish and English gradually evolve. Thanks to money, which permits exchanges, the emergence of markets, and the need to communicate with others. And since I need to communicate with others and close a deal that will be honored, contracts and law emerge, thanks to money. And since in many areas I need to develop patterns of honest behavior and integrity, etc., morality is refined, thanks to money. If money were to disappear, we'd go back to the age of Mad Max. The quantity of human interactions and the opportunities for interaction we now enjoy would be reduced to a tiny fraction. We would go back to the cave period. Morality would be forgotten. Law would be forgotten. The Spanish language would disappear. There would be a regression. That has also been studied historically and anthropologically. Society is an extremely complex network of interactions which consist of exchange relationships. Money makes it possible for those exchanges to increase, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to levels we cannot even imagine. And it is in that process of increasing exchanges that the rest of the institutions, linguistic, legal and moral institutions, are formed and refined. Therefore, dear students, money is the quintessential social institution, the most important one. But we'll go a step further. Every voluntary exchange, this is an essential law of economics, and it is so important that we're going to repeat it over and over again. Every voluntary exchange results from an inequality in subjective valuations, and these valuations are the reverse of each other. Each party must subjectively value what he lacks, and hopes to receive more than what he has and plans to give. If this inequality in subjective valuations does not exist, the exchange is not made. The voluntary exchange does not take place. All exchanges occur and are considered because, a priori, both parties believe they come out ahead in the exchange. If they do not come out ahead, voluntary exchanges do not take place. A couple marries because both spouses believe that they will come out ahead, that what they will receive in stability, love, etc. from the other party is worth much more to them than what they are going to give. If not, the voluntary exchange does not occur. It's important that you always remember this, because a legion of philosophers have been wrong in this area. For example, Aristotle, and through him, St. Thomas Aquinas, and even philosophers of today. They have thought, when there is an exchange, there is equality, and when two things are exchanged, they are equal. They have a common denominator. No, nothing could be more untrue. Where forces are equal, there is no movement. If the force in this direction is equal to this one, nothing moves. There is no change. Change always implies inequality. The parties in a voluntary exchange must make unequal valuations. They must both value what they lack and hope to receive more than what they have and are going to give in the exchange. If this is not the case, the exchange does not take place. Moreover, in any voluntary exchange, both parties must be convinced that they will gain as a result. If not, the exchange does not take place. Well, right now we're going to observe a marvelous effect. We have studied two laws. Do you remember the law of marginal utility? What does the law of marginal utility say? It says that each one of us values the relevant and fully interchangeable units of means available to us in terms of the value we attach to the last unit on our value scale. And to what conclusion does the law of marginal utility lead us? It leads us to conclude that the more units we have available to us, the lower the marginal utility. Marginal utility diminishes. Well, now we've reviewed the law and we'll set it aside for the moment. Now, let us recall the second law we studied, the poorly named law of the division of labor, actually of knowledge, or Ricardo's law of association, the law of specialization. According to this law, human beings realize that we benefit if we specialize in a specific area and exchange our products for those of others. Imagine a society in which each one of us specialized in one specific and unique line of production and did nothing else. You would make shirts and only shirts, you shoes and only shoes, you books and only books, and so on. Everyone would produce something different. What would happen? I ask you. Would she value very highly the 100 shirts she produced each week? No, she would have only shirts. And the law of marginal utility tells us that the value of the last shirt, which would be almost nothing, would determine the value of each and every one. She would make only shirts, and the shirts she had would be of almost no value to her. But take note, she would lack shoes, food products, etc. She would have none of these. What marginal utility would shoes and food have for her? They are the other goods she would need. Would their utility be high or low? Extremely high. Think about it. What she had would be worth almost nothing to her, but what she lacked would be tremendously valuable. And this gentleman, Mark, would make shoes. How much would the shoes be worth to him if he had 500 pairs of shoes like Imelda Marcos? Would they be worth a lot or a little? His own products would be of almost no value to him, because they would be his specialty, but what he lacked would be of high value, and the same would be true for you, and so on. Let's fuse the two laws together. The law of specialization, which says each person should specialize in the area in which he or she has a relative comparative advantage, and the law of marginal utility. In a society, for illustrative purposes, our class, if each one of us specialized in a specific and unique area, and we had many goods from that area but lacked all others, I ask you, in light of the law of marginal utility, under these circumstances, what incredibly powerful force would spontaneously emerge in that society? What would we immediately do? What would we set out in search of? What would we pursue? What? Exchanges. If each of us specialized in a particular sphere, and what we had was of almost no value to us, but we valued very highly what others had, and this was true for all of us, the incredibly powerful force that would immediately emerge would consist of exchanges. You would be contacting this person, and this person, and this person. Everybody would want to make exchanges. Immediately, in a fraction of a second, we would all start trading things, because what we have is worth almost nothing to us, and what others have is worth a lot, and vice versa. And that, dear students, is society, an extremely complex network of exchanges. Let's begin by imagining, for instance, a direct exchange or barter transaction. We have two people, A and B. A is a butter manufacturer. This young lady, whose name is Rosa, is a butter manufacturer. She has so many kilos of butter that the nth kilo of butter, let's say the 200th kilo she has in the refrigerator, is worth less than, that's what this symbol means, the first shirt or sweater that she does not have. This is merely a subjective comparison. Notice, we're talking about subjective valuations, which permit only comparisons. In other words, the ordinal realm. However, Mark is standing right next to her, and he is a shirt manufacturer. He's right beside her. Well, Mark has a lot of shirts, so the last shirt is worth less to him than... Mark lacks butter, and it turns out he's a big eater. I know that well, because the other day I treated him to dinner, and it cost me a pretty penny. What Mark wants is butter, to spread on some nice warm toast tomorrow at breakfast. Right, Mark? Yes. Okay. Well, of course it's clear that the last shirt is worth almost nothing to him, because he specializes in making shirts. It's the law of marginal utility. However, just the thought of butter makes his mouth water. So, Mark values the last shirt he has much less than the first kilo of butter he lacks. Well, under these circumstances, if Rosa is here making butter she hardly values at all, and she needs shirts, and Mark is right beside her, and he's making shirts he hardly values at all, and he needs butter, then clearly, if they have even a shred of entrepreneurial ingenuity right next to each other, they will immediately have a realization. The entrepreneurial light bulb will go on for them. I'll draw it here so you'll remember it. And it's an incandescent bulb too, the kind the Minister for Industry doesn't like. The light bulb goes on. Hey, we'd come out ahead if we'd made an exchange. I'll trade you 1 kilo of butter for a shirt. Is there inequality in opposite subjective valuations, the necessary condition? Yes. Do both parties benefit? Yes. Because Rosa values the shirt very highly, and Mark values the butter very highly. They make an exchange, and as a result of that exchange, both come out ahead. And since it is an exchange, without money, it is what we have called a direct exchange or a barter transaction. Now let's look at an example of an indirect exchange. In modern economies, these are the most vital exchanges, since they are the ones that permit economic calculation. Let us suppose a worker is unemployed. You're not unemployed, but let us imagine that you are. What's your name? Javier. Javier has been unemployed for 6 months, and he gets up in the morning and he goes to the newsstand and buys the paper. And he takes a walk in Retiro Park. And he takes the dog out and he looks at his watch and the hours drag on endlessly. What should I do? And what should I do this afternoon? There's no end to this. What a pain. Nevertheless, he has to pay bills and they keep on coming. So, although Javier is a little on the lazy side, admit it, the nth hour of free time, it's one thing to be lazy and it's quite another to do nothing all day long, day after day. And Javier has been fed up for a month now. The last marginal hour of free time is worth practically nothing to him. He's thinking, hey, isn't there anything you need done? Anything you could ask me to do? To him, that last hour is worth less than the first 20 euros he lacks and needs to pay his bills. And let's suppose that opposite him is an entrepreneur. I've put the word entrepreneur in quotation marks, because right now I'm not referring specifically to someone who exercises pure entrepreneurship, but to a historical ideal type. We'll talk about what that means later. He has an entrepreneurial project, and he has considerable capital at his disposal. So, although the last 20 euros are worth something to him, they are relatively insignificant. However, he does urgently need an hour of labor. So to him, 20 euros are worth much less than the services provided by that specialized worker, in this case, Javier. If they both become aware of this inequality in opposite subjective valuations, that is, if they realize they would benefit by making a deal, the light bulb goes on for them, and they discover the profit opportunity. Profit opportunities tend to be discovered because they act as powerful magnets that attract people to exchanges. That fusion of the law of marginal utility and the law of specialization, as we have seen. The two would immediately agree on the following exchange. I'll pay you 20 euros for an hour of work, and they would both come out ahead. The unemployed worker would have employment and receive 20 euros, and the entrepreneur would receive an hour's work, And since money would be used, this would be an indirect exchange. There is a fundamental difference here, because the indirect exchange involves what is called a historical ratio of exchange, that is, a market price, specifically 20 euros an hour. A market price is any historical ratio of exchange expressed in monetary units. Ratio of exchange in monetary units. And that is the marvel. Dear students, the marvel is that the whole thing starts with subjective valuations which cannot be measured, and yet, in the end, it takes the form of a number, the result of a numerical calculation, 20 euros. And that is an observable historical fact. In a certain place, at a certain moment in history, the price of an hour of work was 20 euros. And this fact can be used by many other entrepreneurs in their numerical computations, either regarding the past, retrospectively, to determine whether they have gained or lost, or the future, prospectively, to gauge, based on the monetary prices which emerge in the market, which alternative is most worthwhile to them. Money and voluntary exchanges make economic calculation possible. They give rise to monetary prices, which are expressed in numbers, and numbers can be used in computation. Mises compares prices to snowflakes. Both are ephemeral. Snowflakes fall to the ground, melt and disappear. Well, prices are all historical ratios of exchange. Once a deal is closed at a certain price, the price is like a snowflake. It becomes a historical fact. Nevertheless, such historical facts, especially if recent, prove invaluable to entrepreneurs by helping guide their action, as we shall see in our next classes.